Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. Before we speak with today's guest, Jim Willis, let's hear a story from Matthew from New Mexico, whose story also encompasses a couple of things that Jim and I's conversation did, namely having a past that began in fundamentalist Christianity, and also the importance of dreams and how sometimes they can communicate some very tangible things to us.
When I was 20 years old, I lived in Pennsylvania for the summer. I spent my time reading the book of 1 John from the Bible, playing my mandolin and looking at flowers in my flower identification guide. I lived on a tomato farm out in the country by the Susquehanna River, and it was beautiful. I'd always had psychic visions and mystical inclinations from a very young age, but the fundamentalist Christianity that I grew up in was really scientific materialism, because it kind of gave over all the worldly, so to speak, all the earthly realm to kind of the normal way of looking at things, which is that anything that seems magical or seems unexplainable is explainable, and it's explainable in physical terms. You know, the mind is reduced to the brain. There's an explanation for everything, and it's a physical explanation. So that's kind of how I was raised, and I never really had a place for all the visions I had. That the book of 1 John says God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And that eventually revolutionized my idea of God, because I realized that my idea of God was not God, because I worried about God and things like that. So eventually this whole summer really was a seed for what became eventually leaving the church at about age 30, leaving it completely finally, and dedicating myself to being a full-time witch or something like that. So this is the story. I had a recurring dream that summer of being on a boat, standing against the wall, and in front of me there's a platform with a railing, and the water is out there, of course, because we're out on a boat. And there's these two maybe 13, 14, 15-year-old Chinese kids standing out there, a male and a female, and they're kind of like surreptitiously touching each other, kind of touching hands and making eyes at each other in a very kind of like young adolescent way, right? Sneaky and uncomfortable and awkward. And I'm just standing there observing, not really being creepy, but you know, there's a lot of people on the boat, but I'm just noticing these two doing this. And then one of their, I guess, siblings perhaps, or somebody they're traveling with, seems like a sibling kind of relationship, comes out, and this young child's of 6 or 7, and he points at them and says, "You two are flirting," and then they instantaneously stop, they pull their hands away and kind of walk off. And then my vision in the dream would pan to the right, and there was somebody selling popcorn out of a popcorn machine there, and a few people there buying popcorn. And I had this vision. It wasn't a vision, it was a dream. I had the dream 3 times. I wrote it down in detail. I saw the entire scene 3 times. So, I had it 3 times. It was verifiably there. I had even talked to people about it because it was so unusual. It was a very specific vision I had. So at the end of the summer, when I was leaving Pennsylvania, somebody took the group of us who were working there up to New York City. And while we were there, we took the Staten Island ferry to look at the Statue of Liberty, which is it's a great way to look at the Statue of Liberty. As we were going across, I was standing on the ferry, and I snapped into the dream vision. I was standing there, and the Chinese kids were standing there in front of me. They were flirting. It was the same kids. I had seen them already, and I was like, oh my God, this little kid's about to walk out. I've seen this before. So I knew that I had a premonition of this. I knew I had a premonition of it, even, right? Because at that time I was still testing if there was really magic in the world. And so I knew that I knew. It was one of those moments of major confirmation for me. So yeah, the kids were there flirting. They were touching hands. They were laughing, kind of, making eyes at each other. And then out from my right, just like in the dream, this 6 or 7 year old kid comes out, young boy, and he says, "You two are flirting," and they immediately stop and then walk away. And then I look to the right, and there's the person selling popcorn and the people there buying the popcorn. That's kind of inconsequential in the particulars of the dream, perhaps, although you could read into that. But yeah, it was a seed for me, because it was one of those things where I knew that I knew, and it was a conscious thought process for me, thinking about if magic was real, if everything could be reduced to some sort of not scientific, but materialistic explanation. And at that moment, I knew it couldn't. That I had 3 dreams of this vision, and then I had seen it. So that's an unexplainable, mysterious experience I've had. And since I've adopted this witch worldview, I live in magic every day. I mean, I have magical experiences all the time, and purposely so. Things that seem acausal on a material plane, but definitely connected. So anyway, thanks for listening.
In transhumanism, we hear of those, think Ray Kurzweil and Hans Moravec, who feel as if the physical human body as it is somehow falls short of some sort of idealized perfection. Transhumanists feel as if the human body should be enhanced by technology to evolve and eventually abandoned altogether. This frames the body as a feebly limited vessel that couldn't possibly be an adequate interface with the realm of coarse matter. Immortality seems to be an obvious goal, but only as long as it's tethered to matter. That being said, there can also be benefits from being able to leave one's body, but it helps to be open to the possibility of non-physical realms, for this can be a way to experience what ethereal planes of existence lie just beyond what our senses can convey to us. Today's guest, Jim Willis, has written a book about such experiences and how to cultivate them, entitled The Quantum Akashic Field, A Guide to Out-of-Body Experiences for the Astral Traveler. I start off the conversation by asking him how he went from being a fundamentalist Christian to writing a book about astral travel.
It's a long story. When I was first went into ministry, I kind of expected, like we all did when we were young, and it was the early 70s, we all expected to go into this climate, this group of people, this community that was going to be constantly involved in spiritual growth and asking the big questions: who are we and why are we here? That's why people get involved in ministry in the first place. But something happens when you get in there. Politics rears its ugly head, and all the planning that has to go into it, and you're planning the next this or the next that, and pastoral counseling, and all of the committee meetings, and all of that kind of stuff. And pretty soon 40 years goes by, and you find yourself saying, what happened? Where did it go? You never enter into that area that really you want to, that experiential area where you're not talking about God, you're talking, and instead of talking about God, you begin to experience the reality of spirit. I almost hesitate to use the word God nowadays, because that word has so many connotations. It carries so much baggage for so many people. But a lot of um, a lot of the pathway was that idea of trying to have that experience with spirit that I went into it for. And then somewhere along the line, my fundamentalist religion began to just fall by the wayside. I went from the right hand side of the spectrum toward the left, and through all of the stages, fundamentalism, evangelicalism, the charismatic movement for a while, the liberal movement. And one day it all kind of fell apart. I was sitting at my desk doing a sermon, and I was doing it my typical way. I was picking out Bible verses from here and there and buttressing everything that I had to say with these certain proof texts, you know. And it suddenly occurred to me that I had been a truth which seems very obvious right now, but back then I had been covering it up. I've been burying it, and that's that I was no longer really seeking God. I was seeking. I was preaching about the Bible, a certain interpretation of the Bible.
Yeah.
And as soon as you realize that, you realize God isn't the center of your life. The Bible is the center of your life. And not only the Bible, but a particular interpretation of the Bible.
Yes.
And it all fell apart for me. I thought I was going to have to leave ministry, to tell you the honest truth. I thought it was all over. And so I went on retreat. I had built a little log cabin up in the woods up in New Hampshire. And I went for on a retreat up there. 4 days. I wasn't going to see anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I just wanted to think and try to decide what I was going to do next. It was a spiritual crisis. And about the third or fourth day in, I'm not sure which. I hope you can share this story. But the third or fourth day in, I decided to go on a hike up this mountain. And I'd been I hiked this mountain many times, and it served my purpose perfectly that day, because it was a tough climb, but when you got to the top, it all opened up. You could see forever. And while I was going to go up there, and I was going to sit on this big rock that sits up there at the top. Most important about this mountain, I'd never seen anybody else there. And so I climbed up this mountain, and I came out of the woods, and I came to the rock that I was going to sit on, except it was already occupied by a nude woman who was sunbathing. And you come out of the woods, a fundamentalist minister, and there's a nude woman sitting on a rock. You know, I mean, that's the scariest thing that can happen to a fundamentalist minister. You begin to think God's got this sense of humor. He takes you up the mountain just like Moses, and then instead of giving you the 10 Commandments, he introduces you to a nude woman on the rock. So I immediately was going to turn around, and I was all worried and embarrassed, and I was going to walk out because it's just it was a scary thing. And she said, "Come on over, join me." Well, how do you say no to a nude woman on a rock, you know? So I went over and I sat down, and we started to talk. And she was into crystals. She was into reincarnation. She was into ESP, psychokinesis, and all of these things. And also, she was very interested in talking to me about what I believed in and my spiritual formation. There was no judgment. And I found myself having the first real spiritual conversation that I had had in years. I'd had a lot of religious conversations, but this was a totally different person. She wasn't trying to convert me, and I wasn't trying to convert her. But somehow, when we left and went our separate ways, I said, she was going down the mountain one way, and I was going the other way. I said, "I don't even know your name." And she said, "Well, does it matter?" And I walked down that mountain a changed person. I realized how narrow my faith was, how narrow my religion was. And it just opened up my whole world. I didn't leave the Christian church. I still consider myself a Christian, although probably there are a whole lot of Christians in the world who don't consider me a Christian. But I still consider myself a Christian. Not that I think Christianity is better than any other religion, but
Sure.
it's just that it has the metaphors that I'm comfortable with. It has the lessons that I have learned. And now when I read the Bible, it's a totally different beast. I'm seeing totally different things in it. Never occurred to me that Ezekiel could have seen a flying saucer. It never occurred to me that Isaiah might have had a real spiritual journey into a real another a totally different dimension. Never occurred to me to listen to the Apostle Paul when he talks about his out-of-body experience in 2 Corinthians. And I began to start studying other religious traditions, and that eventually led to a career as a college professor teaching world religions. And it just opened up everything. So when you say, how does a fundamentalist get involved with out-of-body experiences? It seems like a natural progression. You know how sometimes a movie can roll by, but there are certain scenes that stick in your mind, not like moving pictures, but like slides. And I can see turning points in my life that came. One of the greatest turning points was us coming up here to the woods. We wanted to come up here. When I retired, we now said, we've got time to really confront the essential reality rather than the illusion that we had up to this time thought was reality. We had time to really confront it. And we're going to take that time. We're going to pull ourselves away from the world. We're going to go on retreat. And the idea was to stay for 1 year and watch the seasons change. And that was 10 years ago. And one thing led to another. And here we are, still going strong. The journey continues. It never ending, never ending.
That's incredible. And what's even fantastic about that is that you found a partner to do it with.
Yeah. And it was funny. I have told this story very rarely over the years, but I've had people tell me, well, was it a real person? Was it a spiritual entity? Was it an angel? Was it something else? And I did tell this story once about 2 years ago. I was doing a radio interview and I told this story. And even before the interview was over, I had a click on my website, an email through my website. A woman who lived up in New Hampshire told me that she had a friend who came down from Middle Barrett Mountain. I know on the radio I never said it was Middle Barrett Mountain, but she said, friend who came down from Middle Barrett Mountain. She said this friend was kind of a free spirit. She was into all this New Age stuff. And she said, man, I met a fundamentalist minister up on the mountain. I think I kind of blew his mind a little bit. Well, they had lost touch with each other, so she didn't know where her friend was. But man, if her friend is listening to this broadcast, please call me. I have to say thank you to you. It changed my life. It really did.
And we'll get to ways to contact you at the end of this conversation for sure.
Great.
So, okay, going to the subject of the book, which, I mean, it covers a lot of different ground here, but you cover a couple of different forms of out-of-body travel. You mentioned etheric travel and astral travel. What is the difference between those two things?
Well, it's kind of a technical difference, and generally it's understood that etheric travel, well, even before we get into either one of those, the question is, when we get out of body, do we really leave our body, or are the quantum reality folks teaching us that it's not a matter of leaving here nor there? The essential us, the essential being is already one with everything. It's already united with everything. So maybe we don't even really leave as much as we just become aware of a greater reality. But in terms of the metaphor of leaving the body, if we say to that, etheric travel is generally considered to be travel within this material universe. The Army experimented in this when they were talking about remote viewing, for instance, of actually being able to see someplace on Earth, or even someplace in the heavens. There are people who have claimed to have gone to Mars or gone to some foreign galaxy, or I've even had a couple of experiences where I seem to be holding the whole universe in my hands. I thought it was just me, and it turns out to be a very common thing about those. But it's involved in traveling within this particular material reality that's described by Newtonian physics, for instance, the places where mass and material, it's this side of the Higgs field, let's put it that way. Akashic travel is a different thing. In Akashic travel, that's more similar to what the ancient shamans used to do, where they used to have these trips and they would actually see entities that were not of this dimension, would actually see entities that they could only describe as having half human and half animal, for instance. I'm absolutely convinced that some of the great painted caves in Western Europe, Lascaux and some of the others, show paintings, and some of the pictographs out in the southwest of the United States. They're actually showing these fantastic creatures. I don't think necessarily those are just metaphors. They're seeing something. The problem is that language out there on the other side is really not needed. And when you come back, it's not adequate. So you're seeing something that's totally outside your experience and trying to explain it with words that are invented to explain this particular reality.
Yes.
So Akashic travel, or that kind of out of body travel, yeah, astral travel, it can seem kind of fantastic, but I don't think it's the travel that's fantastic. I think it's trying to explain what it is that's so difficult. When I first came back from my first astral travel like that, I was trying to talk about it to my wife, and I was so frustrated because here I am, a writer, and I can't find words to say what I'm trying to describe. I can't say this is what it was. All I can say is this is what it was like, and that's very difficult. So that's kind of the difference between astral travel and etheric travel. And like I say, once again, do we actually leave and go? Who knows? Part of us does, part of us stays. I just don't know.
So you probably don't prefer the term the OBE, out of body experience.
Well, I don't like it, but there's nothing really else that's there.
Sure.
It was the term that Robert Monroe used, and he was, of course, the first to make this really popular, the founder of the Monroe Institute up in Virginia. He kind of coined the term, and since then, everybody recognizes it, and they know exactly what it means, but I don't know what else to call it. So I use the term OBE. What else are you going to do?
Then I'll feel safe doing that too.
Oh, sure.
Well, you explain that, or you talk about that, how hard it is to articulate an experience that we might have in those other realms. And you also, and I really like this, it's a very simple metaphor, but it totally makes sense, that we are sort of deceived by our senses. We're sort of trapped by our physical senses. How to talk a little bit about that dynamic?
I like to say that we are living within a five-sided fence, and that fence is made up of the five physical senses: touch and sight and smell and hearing and taste, and those surround us. And over the top of them is a roof, and the roof is what I call our intellect. Now, those senses are wonderful. Don't get me wrong. We have evolved within that sensory perception realm, because what they do is kind of filter out all this information that's coming to us that we don't know is there. And if we did know it was there, it would just overwhelm us. I like to talk about, for instance, back in the old days when we had black and white TV sets with rabbit ears,
Oh yeah.
and you're just a normal person going about your normal day, and all of a sudden you pick up these rabbit ears and the picture changes.
Yes.
And you turn them and it gets fuzzier and clearer, and you realize you weren't even aware of the fact that all of these television signals are bopping through your body. You're not even aware of that because they're outside of our sensory perception.
Mm-hmm.
And so the senses are important. The trouble is that they filter out a lot of stuff. And we have decided that within that sensory fence, within that sensory perception realm, we have decided that that's reality. And that's everything there is. Carl Sagan popularly said that back when he first did Cosmos. The universe is everything that there is. No, I don't think the universe is reality. It's our reality. It's a reality. But there's a bigger reality outside that fence. And that's really all out-of-body travel is. you find this in all of the sacred literature too. This is nothing new. In the Bible, for instance, at Christmas time, I used to love to sing Christmas carols. Angels from the realms of glory, wing your way through all the earth, or hark the herald angels sing. And what we're singing about is extra dimensional entities. We call them angels. And word angel just means angelos from the Greek. It means messenger. Stepping from one reality into another reality and singing to a bunch of shepherds. Now, I always thought that was just a metaphor and made some nice Christmas carols, but now I begin to wonder, were they aware of something? Did something happen? And were there perception realms for that moment? Were they able to see and understand outside that perception fence that surrounds us? More and more, I'm beginning to think, yeah, these things are real and these things are possible. And when I first had the opportunity to have the experience of getting outside the perception realm and looking out into that kind of reality, to be honest, it was so big and it was so beautiful. I didn't want to come back. And often that happens to me. I'd rather stay. I really would. But something in me says it's not time yet. On the other hand, it certainly takes away your fear of death. Boy, because you know that death is just a matter of stepping outside the perception fence.
Sure.
And when you've seen what's out there, I had a good friend one time who was in a hospital. He was quite a bit older than me. He was in my church. And I got a call in the middle of the night from a nurse in the hospital and said, Bradley is dying. He's probably not going to make it through the night, and he wants to see you. Can you come? So I said, of course I will. And I put on my clothes and I went down, drove down to the hospital and got to his hospital bed. And he and I were close enough to where I could be pretty frank with him. I didn't have to beat around the bush like most people do nowadays, about death. And I could say, Bradley, are you ready to go? Now, this man had 2 doctorates. He had founded a university. He was a very intelligent man, well-liked, pillar of the church, pillar of the community. I held all kinds of political offices in the community. Everybody loved him. And I said, Bradley, are you ready to go? If anybody lived a satisfying life, he has. He started crying. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, Jim, he said, I've done a lot in my life, but the one thing I've never done is to prepare for this moment. He wasn't ready to face death. Now, we were lucky. He got through that night and he made it through 10 more. And over the next 10 days, I spent a lot of time with him. I went to his hospital room every day for the next 10 days. And we talked and talked. I honestly don't know if I did anything for him, but I know he did a lot for me. And I know that when my time comes, when I'm in his place, I'm not going to have to worry. Without sounding at all morbid, I'm looking forward to it. I really am. We all have to die, and when you know what's coming, and when you know how good it is, so wow. I mean, it takes away any fear you have. Which the Apostle Paul said the same thing in the New Testament. The last enemy destroyed is death. Well, for me, that enemy doesn't exist anymore. And so there's a practical aspect to these out-of-body travels too.
Absolutely. So what caused you to make the correlation that these OBEs were related to after-death experiences?
Which do you mean? These?
Well, you said having these experiences out of body caused you not to fear death. What made you think that? Yeah. What made you think that those 2 things were related? Those 2 experiences.
Because I've never had a bad out-of-body experience except for once. And every experience that I've had over there just seems to be suffused with light and love and acceptance and compassion. And you get the idea that the true nature of the universe is found in all of those words. It sounds hokey, but wow, it is so welcoming and affirming. And strange to say, you're never alone. You always feel that there's someone watching out for you or something watching out for you. The only time I ever had a bad out-of-body experience is when I wrote in one of my books. I think it was in Supernatural Gods. I wrote in that book that I had never had an out-of-body experience, and within 2 days, I had had a bad out-of-body experience. And I think it was just to teach me that the universe consists of all different kinds of experiences. There's all kinds of things out there. But those wonderful words that we just bandy about, like love and acceptance, compassion. I mean, acceptance doesn't even do it. It feels like you're home somehow, and that this is not the reality. This isn't your home. That's the home out there. Well, once again, here I keep going back to the Bible, but I for some reason tonight. But the Apostle Paul said, "I would much prefer to be absent from the body and present with the Lord." And I guess that's what he was talking about.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
So, do you think that you said that you were tempted not to come back because it was such a positive experience for you having these out of body experiences? Do you think that if you chose not to come back, that you could make that decision? You could make that leap consciously?
I wonder. I don't know. Sometimes it feels that way. Um, except that another word that fits it is honesty. Um, and when you honestly know what is the right thing to do, and if the right thing to do is to come back, you have to. It's not like you have a choice. It's that it's the right thing to do, and
Sure.
doing the wrong is just impossible.
Hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's what death is. Maybe someday we go over there and decide not to come back. I know I've talked
Sure.
to a lot of people who have had near-death experiences, and they've talked about not wanting to come back, but they knew they had to for some reason.
Sure.
Usually it involves other people,
Yes.
responsibility to other people.
Unfinished
And
business.
so I just don't know for sure. But when someday maybe that's what death is. I think I'll stay instead of going back, that kind of thing.
I was just curious because I've heard stories of Tibetan lamas who they come to a place in their lives where they think it's time to go on to the next incarnation, and they
Yeah.
basically sit down to meditate, and that's it. They leave their bodies and they never come back.
Wow. What a way to go though, huh?
Yeah, totally
That would be so
consciously.
much. That would be so much better than the typical American way of death, where we just fight it every step of the way.
Absolutely.
And all of I can't tell you the number of people that I have visited in the hospital as a minister. You call the hospital beds. People who have had car accidents or something like that, or people who have had heart attacks. And you go in, and they're sitting there with IV drips, and with oxygen, and with heart monitors, and with stuff hooked up, and they got all these tubes going, and they're flushing in this and flushing out that.
Yeah.
And then I say, wow, what happened? They said, well, I guess it just wasn't my time.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe it was.
Yes. Did you ever see a movie or hear of a movie called Bringing Out the Dead with Nicolas Cage?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's amazing. It's a movie made from a book written by a real life ambulance driver, and this guy drives an ambulance. He's having a hard time with it. He drinks a lot. He's miserable, but he's compelled to do this job because he feels like he wants to help people so bad. Well, he
Wow.
goes, and then he gets to a point in his life, and he doesn't know whether it's from exhaustion or the delirium from the alcohol, but he starts seeing dead people. He starts seeing the spirits of people, and he goes into this hospital room to check on this patient that he just brought in because his daughter, the patient's daughter, was in the room, and she was really worried about him. So he thought he would just look in to see how he was doing. And this guy's spirit is saying, "Quit trying to resuscitate me. Let me go. I want to get out of this body. It's my time."
Wow.
And they kept just
Wow.
taking the defibrillator and bringing him back. And it was really made you think about things in a different way,
I'm going to have to see that.
Oh, it's really, yeah, it's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
I think it's on some streaming channel, but I can't think of which one it is. But I highly recommend it. I think you
I'll
would
look it up.
Yes.
I'll look it up. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate
Absolutely. Well, do you think that you mentioned dreams a lot in this book, and you even mentioned lucid dreams, I believe. Do you think that there's a possibility that a lucid dream might just be an unconscious or an unintentional out-of-body experience?
that. Well, there again, I don't see why not. I think we make a mistake when we use our language to try to categorize too carefully some of these experiences that are just beyond our reality. But I'm almost of the opinion now that every night, um, most people have out of body experiences. We call them dreams, and some of them may be just regular dreams. But I almost think that the reason we sleep, and I've read a lot of books on it. Nobody knows exactly why we have to sleep, but we do. And I think the reason we sleep is because this material world that we live in, I don't think we could handle it unless we could step out of it and recharge. Recharge the batteries and recharge the mind, recharge our connection to source. I think we go mad if we do. As a matter of fact, if you eliminate dreams, if you don't allow people to dream, eventually they do go mad.
That's right.
And then after that, they die. So I think they're very important. And I think some of this is a return. And the reason they seem so fantastic is because when we leave the body behind, so to speak, and our consciousness is free to expand and experience this reality outside our normal perception fence, then when we come back, we're left with all of these images. Our brains are trying to say, what was it that you just experienced? And so it flips through the Rolodex of experiences we have. And it said, well, it was this and this and this and this. So we come up with these crazy dreams that just seem to make no sense. But one thing I've discovered, the more out-of-body experiences I've had, and the farther I go into it every year, my dreams are much more vivid than they used to be. And sometimes that's not a good thing. Sometimes I wake up and I don't even know where I am,
Sure.
And it is tough. But in lucid dreaming, what a person in a lucid dream actually dreams while knowing they're dreaming and can control it somewhat, which is very much like what an out-of-body experience is. In an out-of-body experience, you're seeking that that balance between the body being relaxed enough to not be in the way but not be asleep, and between the mind being focused enough on the one-point meditation, focused enough to really be able to see where you're going and to ride it, to stay with it. And when you find that balance, in effect, I suppose you could call it a lucid dream in that sense. I mean, you're dreaming, but you're aware of the dreaming. The difference is that when you're aware of it, you are able to, when you start meeting other entities, or when you start seeing things that are later proven to be true that you didn't understand, seeing landscapes that all of a sudden you see, or seeing people, especially people who have gone on and they look totally different. They look younger. They look totally healthy and all that kind of thing. So I would suppose I would have to say the lucid dreams are connected in a way to out-of-body experience. The only reason I keep from saying going 100% that way is I don't want people to think that I'm saying that, an out-of-body is just a lucid dream. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I think it's much more than that.
Well, and speaking of meditation, you have a very strong and long meditation practice. How do you also utilize OBEs in your meditation practice too, right?
Yeah. Meditation is tough. I am not. I do not consider myself a real serious. I'm a real experienced meditator. I've talked to Buddhist and Hindu friends, for instance, who just put me to shame. It's a practice that I really started only about 10 years ago, and it was one of the reasons I came out here to the woods in the first place. The lives that all of us lead out there in the world, they're so hectic, and they're so loud, and they're so fast, and there's so much to take in. I sat down one time just for the fun to try to remember all the numbers I'm supposed to remember, my social security number, my phone number, I can't even remember my passwords, I've got to, can't even do any of that. There's just so much of that our brains are so busy that I found it wasn't enough just to take a half hour off here or an hour off there. I had to get away. That's why we came out here to the woods. We wanted to live in a meditation. And now I'm almost kind of disappointed if the day goes by and I don't meditate for at least an hour, maybe two. But when you're in that, I find myself when I start to meditate now, the first half hour of my meditation is almost always what I call wasted because I'm just trying to calm down. And then usually something happens after the first half hour, 45 minutes. Something happens, and I finally begin to find that state. I wish I could do it all the time. Unfortunately, what happened with me was I I got very comfortable, and I was having a very active out of body experience life, and very active in meditation, and I was getting really good at it. And I was very proud of myself. So I wrote a book. And then when you write a book, you have to start thinking about talking to people about the book and selling the book and doing the technology that's involved in marketing the book. And it pushes you right back into the world again. It's very difficult. And it's something that I'm always struggling with. I notice now that my out of body experiences are fewer and far between than they were when I didn't really do anything except concentrate on them rather than try to market them.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's tough. It's a tough world we live in. We just don't realize it.
Well, yeah, especially for people who are looking for something outside of what is right between us. Not right between us, but what our senses are telling us is there. Because we're surrounded by materialism. We're surrounded by scientific rationalist reductionism that just wants to reduce everything to what can be replicated, what can be measured in a laboratory. Yeah, it just doesn't cover everything. It doesn't even
No.
begin to cover 0.1% of anything.
And I think it's getting worse. I've written a lot of books about ancient civilizations and ancient gods and lost civilizations. And my new book coming out in May is called Hidden History. And dealing with all of these ancestors, the ones that go way back, I'm convinced that they lived a totally different life than we do because they were not surrounded by all of this materialism. They had long periods of uninterrupted time and quiet, and they could stare at the skies. I'd be really curious to do a test sometime and find out, ask a number of people, what phase is the moon in? I'll bet out of every 100 people, I bet you 90 of them won't even know because we just don't look at the skies anymore. And they lived in that. So I think their experience of reality was totally different than ours. They had a toolkit, I call it a psychic toolkit for lack of a better word, that I think was much more developed than ours. I think they may have even had powers that we didn't have. Some of these ancient megaliths, next September, assuming that the virus thing has passed and the airlines are flying again and all that kind of thing, next September, I'm leading a tour to ancient sites in Turkey, and we're going to visit Göbekli Tepe and Dörenkuyu and Çatalhöyük, and we're going to meet in Istanbul and see the things there. And when we go over to those ancient sites where our civilization really began, we wonder, how did they do it? How did they just wake up one day and decide, I'm going to build a Göbekli Tepe, a great temple? Or I'm going to build a Stonehenge or anything. I'm going to build a pyramid. How do they do that? And I'm convinced that they had a psychological technology, a psychic technology that we don't have. It's still in us. I think it's still possible. It's just that it's atrophied because we don't use it anymore. And none of us are born and raised with it. So it's there.
It's a matter of being sensitive to some sort of energy grid or a morphogenetic field where all of our electronic and magnetic fields that are covering the earth make it hard to tune into those things, I think, not to mention light pollution and noise pollution. And it's just hard to settle down enough to even realize that those things exist.
We had a session a couple of weeks ago. We were a friend of mine and I were asked by this wonderful Cherokee woman to come up with our dowsing rods into a place in the woods that she was considered that her people had lived there. She knew that they had lived there, and she had some very interesting things she wanted to show us. So we went up with our dowsing rods. We had spent a wonderful morning with her, and we were dowsing out, and we discovered some burial sites, and we discovered some earth energies coming through and everything else. And of course, when you're dowsing like that, you have to concentrate on earth energy, and you have to be thinking, because there's so many different kinds of energies. On our way out, we were walking, and I had, just for the fun of it, I had my dowsing rods up, and all of a sudden they crossed really hard. And I looked at them and I said, wait a minute, there's something here. I'm looking down at my feet, I'm looking over at my friend, and he's laughing, because right over my head is an energy, a power line going, and I had just been looking for energy. And I hadn't been looking up, I'd been looking down. So I thought it was earth energy. I thought I had found a new ley line or something. No, it was just a power line going by that was filled with an energy that mimicked the very same kind of energy that we've been looking for all day.
Absolutely.
It gets in the way sometimes. It really does.
So where does the quantum part of the title of your book fit in? The quantum physics ties into all this too, right?
Yeah, I think so, because what we're talking about in terms of out-of-body travel, I don't think it's just this woo-woo spiritual stuff. I think there's a science behind it. We just haven't discovered the science yet. And I think that when 100 years ago, when the quantum theory was first developed, and when the quantum field was first discovered, and when quantum reality began to be described, in this weird new element of the quantum, I don't think they were discovering anything new. I just think they were using their mathematics to describe something that shamans and gurus and mystics had been in those landscapes for thousands of years. So here, ever since Galileo and religion and science went their separate paths, they've been going on two separate roads. And I think in our generation, with the discovery of quantum reality, those roads are beginning to meld onto one superhighway. And I think that now the mathematics of the quantum physics are describing the akashic field that the Hindus were talking about 6,000 years ago. Irvin Laszlo, that wonderful, well, he was at first a musician, and the music world lost a genius when we lost Irvin Laszlo, and went to mathematics and to systematic theory and systems theory and that kind of thing. When he started talking about this field, he had to come up with a word that would describe the kind of reality, that one 0-point field that he was talking about. And he couldn't use any modern words that just didn't fit. So we had to go way back to the ancient Sanskrit and come up with the word akasha. And akasha is a field of possibilities, where every possibility exists, and where every possibility will be realized in one way or another. And so when we talk about the akashic field, I think that's where we're traveling. We're traveling into a field of possibilities, a field where every reality that's possible exists. That, incidentally, leads us to one of the great answers to one of the great questions of life. What is our purpose? What is the meaning? When we're in the source, when we're in that union of the source, that wonderful unity, there is no individuality there. You can't experience individuality in the source, because individuality it's total unity. The only way to experience individuality, which is a very important experience, but the only way to get that experience is to leave the source, to make, I think, the very courageous decision that every one of us has made, to leave the source into the material world of individuality, and to experience individuality, and then take that experience back to the source, back into the unity again. Now, the only trouble with experiencing reality is also the field of duality, good and bad.
Yes.
And there's a lot of good things about life, but let's face it, there's a lot of bad things about life too. Mm-hmm. You can't have one without the other. And that's why I call it a courageous decision. I can almost see all of us, I kind of picture it as an energy that all of a sudden decides, that makes the courageous decision that I'm going to experience individuality and all of its blessings and all of its curses. And we step outside of the source. We make the journey. The energy goes through the Higgs field, the recently discovered Higgs field, where energy takes on mass. and we come down here into experience. And when every possibility is finally realized and then taken back to the source, I'm a Trekkie, so I'll say taken back to the collective. But when it's taken back there, then will come to pass again, in the words of the Bible, time will be no more. There'll be no need for it, because all of those experiences will have been realized. Infinite number of experiences. Whether we ever can reach infinity, that's another story.
Eventually, I think so, absolutely. But the world of matter is also sort of tricky too, because it's not like we leave the spirit behind. It's still
Yeah.
connected to our human suits.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, it lends itself to being, to the deception that all there is what we can touch and see and smell and hear, when
Yeah.
really there's a lot more else going on if you just choose to look under the surface or pay attention to all those things that we've learned to filter out, because it doesn't get us to work any quicker.
Yeah, beautiful way of putting it. As a matter of fact, the spiritual entity, the spirit guide that I commune with regularly, it took me a long time to realize that spirit guide that's I picture on the other side of the fence, so to speak, is really me on the other side. It's the part that I left over there.
I like that.
And I think without that connection, we really get into trouble over here. And again, it's in all the religious traditions. In Christianity, they used to talk about guardian angels.
Yes.
That guardian angel is probably nothing more than you, your soul, your spirit. Hindus would talk about Atman, that is on the other side. Matter of fact, the Hindu tradition has a wonderful way of talking about God. They talk about Brahman, and Brahman cannot be described. You cannot find words. Brahman exists in that place where language cannot go. It cannot soil Brahman. I had a good friend who was practiced within the Hindu tradition, and when I first was teaching this to my class in college, I wanted to make sure I got it right. So I went over and I talked to him in the morning before the class, and I said, "I'm going to talk about Brahman today." And he said, very difficult, very difficult. So here's what I'm going to say. And so I did all this stuff talking about Brahman and everything else. And he was a nice guy. He's nodding his head, smiling. And I said, "There, do I have it?" And he nods his head up and down and goes, "No." But then they also talk about Atman, and the nearest English word that we have to talk about Atman is the word soul. It's that within, and the wonderful, wonderful expression in the ancient Sanskrit, the Atman within, Brahman, the unspeakable out, and thou art that. Brahman and Atman are one and the same. And so if we're going to find Brahman out there, we have to find Atman in here, and then we find Brahman. And I think that's a wonderful way of trying to understand the idea of guardian angels or spirit guides from the other side, us who are also out there.
Yeah, not so much maybe like a future self, but a higher self.
A higher self. Yeah, I think so. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, thank you.
Well, you also use a term called quantum intuition. What do you mean by that?
That's tough. There are things that you really can't prove or fully explain to anybody else, but you know they're real. You can't even you don't even have the right to feel frustrated when other people don't get you, because how can you put it into words? You intuit these things that are you just know. It would be like I was a musician for all my life, and I've had the experience of sitting, for instance, within a symphony orchestra. Not a lot of people have had that experience. To hear a Brahms or a Beethoven symphony and being surrounded by it, and feeling the texture and feeling the vibes coming out from all these different musicians who are playing as one, and it's a feeling that it just transports you. Then the concert is over, you go off the stage and you try to explain that feeling to somebody who's never had the experience. Then they now have a choice. They can say, Jim, I don't understand what you're talking about, but I'll believe you that it's something that's real. Or, Jim, you don't know what you're talking about. You made up the whole thing. You can't convince them. All you can do is say, I know it was real. I know I experienced it. And when that happens, um, it's a kind of an intuitive understanding of quantum reality, the quantum possibilities. And I don't know if that comes close to answering your question or not. It's so hard.
Absolutely. What do you think is some evidence of the existence of parallel dimensions?
Well, I like to find it in, I like to say that the two lines of evidence that I've explored, well, actually three. The first is what I call evidence in stone. Uh, those have to deal with the megalithic cultures, the megalithic civilizations that built temples, that built monuments, that raised standing stones for reasons that we don't really understand, but must have been tremendously important to them because it took a tremendous amount of work to do it. You look at, when I was in Stonehenge last time, I just sat there and I wondered what it would have been like to take those blue stones and to bring them from all the way over in Wales and transport them all the way across the country. Why those particular stones had to be brought here? There must have been some reason for it. They must have been in touch with something. If you build a big, difficult monument like that, your tradition, your faith tradition must be a big faith tradition to make you do that. Mm-hmm. So I look for the evidence in stone and I realized they were in touch with something. And because they are so much aligned with the skies and because they are so aligned with energy grids and things on the earth, it's just the mathematics is phenomenal. So I think that's the first line of evidence in stone. The second line is evidence in story, the ancient mythologies and the ancient religions, the oral traditions. They're so unique. They describe the same thing so much. People on one side of the world having a tradition, and people on the other side of the world having the very same tradition. Classic example of this is in the Sumerian legends, in the Sumerian times. They have the great Sumerian flood stories that were the inspiration for Noah's flood in the Bible. And it was talked about the watchers who came down to help the people through, the Anuna gods. And the word Anunnaki comes in, the watchers, the holy ones who were there not only in some cases to cause the flood, but also others, the good ones, help people through that flood time. And they talk about the Anunnaki. Now you go halfway around the world over to the deserts of the Southwest here in the United States, and you come across the Hopi language, the Hopi people, and they've got a flood story as well. The world was going to be flooded because the people had left the gods, and so they were helped by their people called the Ant people. Now in Hopi, the word ant is the word Anu, and the word for people is Naki. Now, why would the Hopi have a flood legend of being rescued by their friends, the Anunnaki, and have that exactly the same as the Sumerian flood legends where the Anunnaki did the same thing? Mm-hmm. To me, that's a proof that there's something going on here it was bigger than all. Of course, the other line of evidence is evidence that won't hold up in court, and that goes right back to this intuitive, the quantum intuitive. Sometimes you just feel something is true and you just know it, and you can't have any reason for it except to know that somehow, yes, that makes sense. With those kind of lines of evidence, I think you can make a pretty good case, an actual physical case, a material case, for parallel realms being recognized by our ancestors going back thousands and thousands of years. And as a matter of fact, it only seems to be within the last couple of 100 years that as a society, we in the West at least have gone away from that. We're the ones that invented this whole idea of material reality, and that's all there is. So that's a relatively new concept, I think, in human being history.
Well, did you mention earlier, I believe you mentioned that the first out-of-body experience that you had was accidental? You sort of stumbled into it?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't want to say it was completely accidental, because in a way I was seeking it. I had come across the books by Bill Buellman, who I've since spent a week studying with Bill. Um, to my way of thinking, he's probably the world's foremost teacher right now on out of body experience, and his seminars are wonderful, and his books are great. I really recommend them to everybody. So I had read the books, and I had seen his techniques, and just kind of wanted to do it. I didn't really expect anything, and he had what he said was that anybody can do this, but you have to be consistent. You have to really, you just can't try to fit it in. You have to work at it. 30 days, 30 minutes a day. And that's what I set out to do. And if I had quit on day 28, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, because it did take that long. And yet when it happened first, and I realized that I was actually looking at my body from outside, and that I could feel the shift within, it was so numbing that it just brought me right back. Wow, I did it. And then of course it was over. So that's hard. But it's so in a sense it was accidental. In a sense I was really trying to make it happen. So I don't know, but that's the hard part. And I urge anybody who, if they're going to seek out of body travel, when it happens, don't be surprised if the first time you're so shocked that you jump right back, because it's all you have to have out there is the slightest idea of thinking about your body, and boom, you're right back in it. It's a very difficult thing. It's not easy, and it takes time, and it takes effort, and it has to become really the most important thing in your life, which is why a lot of people can't do it, because you just can't live that way in modern life a lot, unless you're an old retired minister who lives in the woods. It makes it kind of hard.
How long did it take you before you were able to, I mean, was there ever a point where it became not effortless, but it became relatively easy to get to that stage of being able to leave your body?
Yeah, when I'm in tune, and when I'm separated from the world, which is not easy. When that's happening, and I can have a period of time when that's happening, it can be relatively common. I mean, 3, 4, 5 times a week you can have an out-of-body experience, and you never know what's going to happen. In fact, one of the biggest traps is that once you have a neat experience, you want to repeat it. So you try to repeat it, and it just doesn't work.
Yes.
Lately, to be honest, it's been difficult, because life has kind of drawn me into it. And I found myself thinking about all the things that most of us think about. And I sometimes have to just pull all the plugs, turn off everything, and just really try to get away. And that's hard sometimes. That's hard.
Does your wife also practice out-of-body experiences?
Not to the extent that I do. She does do some very talented dowsing, especially healing dowsing. And she's more comfortable with a pendulum. She's my age, and her wrists are not able to hold up dowsing rods and things like they used to, but she's very comfortable with the pendulum. And she's always been very intuitive. And so she has, matter of fact, she was the one that invented the word perception realm that we use so often. That's what she started calling it. And it turned out to be such a useful word that I use it all the time now.
And one of my questions is asking you about the perception realm. Now would be a great time. What do you mean by that?
The perception, when I use the word perception realm, I'm talking about that area inside our perception fence, the realm where our perceptions rule, taste and touch and smell and all that.
Gotcha.
And we like to think that that's reality. It's not. It's really an illusion. Even scientifically right now, we know what happens. I can look at a tomato that may be sitting, beautiful red ripe tomato that's sitting on my desk, and my perception within my perception realm, I have been taught ever since I was a little kid that tomato is real and it's solid, and I'm real and I'm solid. and I can reach out and interact with it and taste it and all this kind of stuff. Scientifically, we know that that's nonsense. That tomato is a massive swirling energy, just like I am. And it's not solid. You keep taking it apart and you take down the skin, and then you go down eventually the atoms, the subatomic particles, and all that is an energy that is clumped together in the form of a mass that I have learned within my perception realm to say, oh, that's a tomato. But I'm not interacting with that tomato. I'm interacting with a massive swirling energy that appears in that form. And that tomato isn't even interacting with me. And my brain has learned to say that's a tomato, because that's what it is like in this perception realm. It's not that way at all. So what we call reality is the illusion, really.
It's like almost like putting on a virtual reality suit or something. Like
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I know it. I know it. Somebody asked me in my book Lost Civilizations, I talked about all these different realities and everything else, and somebody asked me one time, well, of all the ways the world could have started, all the ways the galaxy, the Big Bang or solid state or whatever, what is the one that's most scientifically real? And I thought about it and thought, I have to say that this whole idea of living in a hologram makes more sense mathematically than any other thing.
It really does.
When you get right down and keep turning that microscope closer and closer to us, what do we turn into a bunch of pixels?
Yep.
And then nothing, just like pixels on a screen. And scientifically, the whole holographic idea makes probably more sense than anything, that we are characters in a virtual reality simulation that have learned to become sentient. And I hate to say that, because I don't want to believe that, but what are you going to do?
Yeah, well, it's not like we're talking about putting on a suit with sensors on it, or yeah, I guess in a sense we are, but it's not like wires or metal pieces or anything like that. It's sort of a wetware, organic sort of virtual reality thing that we have going on. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting.
And if people have trouble with this, know they're in good company. Einstein couldn't accept it when they told him that we create our own reality, and he said, "You mean the moon disappears when I'm not looking at it?" And he just wouldn't accept it. So if Albert Einstein had trouble with it, I guess it's okay for us to worry about it too.
Yeah. We'll give us some wiggle room.
Yeah.
Have you, or do you know of anybody that have done maybe experiments where two or more people sort of set the intent to astral travel at the same time and sort of meet in the astral plane? Have you ever done anything like that?
Yeah, there's some work that's actually being done in that, and it has been done for literally my whole lifetime. Skip Atwater was in the military, and his job was to work with a team of remote viewers, and it was top secret information. And now the Freedom of Information Act has opened this up, and Skip can talk about it now. He's very active up at the Monroe Institute, and he tells these stories about actually. And the reason the reason the United States government was so interested in this is because it came to our attention that Russia was doing it, and we can't have Russia develop it, even though we don't. So they had to develop it too. And there were some people that, McGonagall, for instance, who were very talented. And as he puts it, we discovered that a lot of people have this kind of talent. But it's kind of like music. A lot of people can carry a tune, but not everybody is Mozart, And it's the same thing with out-of-body experiences. And so he talks about experiences where they would deliberately have people try to visualize something and meet up there. Dean Radin has done a lot of work on this out at the Noetic Institute in California. He and I have emailed back and forth a couple of times too, where they have deliberately set up controlled experiments to try to find out if this is possible. And they have to go by statistics. Of course, human beings are frail, so we can't do anything 100% of the time. But if we can be statistically more probable than not in this kind of an experience, with the blind studies showing one set of statistics and the other, the test group showing a higher set of statistics, then we can say that, well, statistically something happened. We don't know what it is exactly, but so people are doing work on it. But again, you can't do work like this without a lot of funding and without a lot of stuff, and you can't get the funding and you can't get all of the interest until you got people really believing that this stuff is true. And we haven't crossed that threshold yet, at least in this country.
Sure. Speaking of remote viewing, I mean, are are they basically the same thing? Remote viewing and out of body travel? Would you say that they're the
Well,
same thing?
yeah, yeah. I think remote viewing is really another way of talking about that etheric travel that we talked about earlier.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And I've had a little bit of experience with this. I was trying to make a long story short. I was trying to find somebody, and I knew the town where they were, and I was able to actually go to that place, and I could actually see a street sign and see a thing. And of course, I was sure it was true, but the skeptic in me wanted to make sure. So I Googled the place, and I Googled the town, and lo and behold, I found the street, I found the road, and I found that as I flew over that place, I saw the house that I had seen. Now, I had never been to this town before, but there it was.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
So I know it's possible.
Well, and you've equated out of body experiences with maybe being in the same sort of realm that we go to after we leave our bodies permanently.
Yeah.
Have you ever encountered anybody in the astral realm that was like, an ancestor or a relative that had passed on? Or have you ever recognized anybody from your material life in that realm?
Just once, and that was when I'm absolutely sure that my father has been reincarnated. And matter of fact, that's who I was looking at. That's who I was looking for when and I had the experience of being in the room where, as a very young child, he was playing, and I had the experience of him recognizing me as a magic friend,
Wow.
invisible friend, and I even found out his name, and his name was Harold. Now, but Harold eventually grew a little bit older, and like all of us, he learned from his society there's no such thing as his imaginary friends.
Yeah.
And now he's close to me, but I got a kick out of it because when I told my wife about it, I said, yeah, and he recognized me. Harold recognized me as his imaginary friend, and my wife looked at me and said, "Hark, Harold's angel." Hark, the Herald angel. And but now that door is closed, of course, because we all have our own things, and that's really the only experience I have had. The experience of seeing other people, and I've been blessed to have 3 or 4 times the experience of finding somebody who died in confusion and didn't go on, and I was able to help them move on to a higher plane like that. At the Monroe Institute in Virginia, they do this kind of thing regularly. And of course, they do it much more scientifically. They have the resources. When somebody has an experience like this, they have the resources to actually look up death figures and birth certificates and discover circumstances and names and everything like that. I've read a tremendous amount of people who have seen other entities and seen their loved ones. I wish now that I can go back and live my life over in some sense, because I can't tell you how many times I've been in a hospital room where somebody died. And while I was holding their hand, in some cases praying with them, they would tell me that my uncle is at the foot of the bed. And I just downplayed it. I didn't criticize them because, how can you do that? But I to myself, I just found myself saying, yeah, right, sure, uncle. Now I'm convinced they actually did see them. They were really there. um, quite a it's quite a humbling experience. And what really gets me is for anybody who may be listening to this and saying, "Oh, come on, you're really getting out there." I understand completely because that was the way I was for most of my life. It's only been in the last 10, 15 years that I have really come to see that this is real.
Hmm. When you say something, excuse me, that somebody died in confusion, do you mean that they passed on and they didn't realize that they passed on?
Yeah, in one case, didn't realize they had passed on, didn't know what had happened, and they were in confusion and
Hmm.
just didn't know what to do, where to go,
Sure.
and were afraid. Perhaps they were so attracted to a particular place or a particular house or a particular um, spot of ground or something like that,
Hmm.
that they just didn't want to leave it. They didn't want to give it up. To them, that was reality, and they were afraid. Um, and it's quite an experience to be able to help somebody uh, into the light, so to speak. You know?
This was while you were having an OBE.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's right.
Wow.
And always unexpected. I never sought it. I never, it was always when I try to have an out of body experience. The whole idea is to try not to necessarily have an experience, but just to put yourself in a reality, in a position where if an experience happens, you're ready for it,
Hmm.
of calm and of peace and openness and focused one point meditation. And so you never know what's going to happen. And so when this happens, I don't feel that I'm necessarily doing anything as much as I'm allowing myself to be used in a way that is important. I wish I could do it all the time, but it's hard. It really is hard to find that particular space and to stay in it when you get there. It's very worthwhile.
Do you think that there are people that get reincarnated and keep coming back to the material realm, and that there are people that don't, that they just go someplace completely different?
Yeah, I definitely believe that. I also definitely have come to understand that this is my last go around down here. I've had many of them. This is my last time here, and I've even had a glimpse about what's next, and I'm very encouraged about it. Um, and in a way, that's kind of a comfort. But I don't know how many lives I've lived. I have identified a couple of them, but in a way, it's kind of nice to know that this is the last time. Next time, it's go on and keep going.
Yeah, yeah. That's amazing. I mean, I could ask you how you came to find that out, but it probably would be very difficult to explain.
Yeah, yeah, it really would be, and a lot of it is very personal too.
Sure,
Uh,
sure.
uh, the Buddha, when Siddhartha was seeking to find enlightenment, and he finally came to the point where he just sat underneath the Bo tree, the tree of wisdom and knowledge, and it was said that in the moment that he discovered his noble truths, in the moment when that happened, when he passed the three temptations, and it's always three temptations, but when he got through the three temptations, he saw all of his past lives and saw how karma had brought them all together.
Hmm.
And he saw his karmic journey and realized all of the different things that had happened to him to bring him to this particular place in time. And I think we have a totally distorted idea of karma. We like to think about we're being punished, or being rewarded. And
Yeah,
I don't think that's it at all. I
sure.
really don't think there is punishment and reward. I think it more has to do with just the experiences we've had that make us who we are. I'm perfectly willing to accept the idea too that while I'm having this experience in this particular part of the multiverse, there's another Jim somewhere else who's making different choices, and another Jim somewhere else is making different choices. And someday we're all going to get together and realize that we've all made those different choices, and every one of them led us on a different path. If we were aware of that while it was happening, we'd go crazy. We couldn't handle the information. So each of us think we're unique, But I like to think that I'm sitting here saying I'm a unique individual, but over in the next multiverse over, there's another Jim saying, "Oh, I'm the unique individual." So
Well, what is there's also a term that you use called non-locality.
yeah.
What is that?
Well, that's a quantum a term that's used in quantum theory. Um, this was what drove Einstein crazy. He called it spooky action at a distance, but it's an experiment that has been conducted over and over and over again. Actually, quantum study is probably the most proven theory of all of science. It's never failed once, and it's been put. All the entanglement means is that if you take two particles that have been entangled, that have been one, and split them in half, put one over on one side of the universe and one on the other side of the universe. If you put a clockwise spin on one of them, the other one will automatically begin to spin counterclockwise because they are entangled. And the information that passes between them passes instantaneously, much faster than the speed of light. Matter of fact, so fast that you say there is no time involved. One spins, the other spins right away. And of course, Einstein's theories say that that's impossible. Nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. I know we like to think when a spaceship goes up, the Starship Enterprise goes up and they get a subspace channel and they can talk to Earth right away in real time. Physically, that's impossible. Even right now, we've got satellites they're like the Voyager that takes months to get a signal back from Voyager. But this happens instantly, and because these two particles were once entangled, they were once one, and once they were entangled, they are forever entangled, no matter how far apart they are. They're still one. That being the reality, if it can work with particles, why can't it work with things that are made of particles, like us? So that's the idea of entanglement. Mm-hmm. We are one with everything. The Zen Buddhists have been saying this for thousands of years. One with everything.
So do you think that as we incarnate or move on to different things in different forms, we're gradually making our way towards being or realizing that we're one with the source?
Yeah, I think so. And I think when we die, that becomes very obvious to us, that mm-hmm. we are one with the source. And I think that's really, I look upon this material universe, if it in fact began at the Big Bang, and who knows how many universes might have happened before that, and if, however it's going to end in the Big Freeze or the Big Crunch or however they want to put it, it is a material universe. And we know for a fact that someday this material universe, billions of years from now, is going to cease to exist. And when that happens, the whole experiment of individuality within materialism, it'll be over. So we are involved, we're in a test tube right now. We are involved in a great big experiment that will someday end. And someday we will return to the source and then realize that we never left. Because when we say someday, that's a term involving time.
Yes.
And time doesn't exist out there. So in one sense, this takes so many billions of years for a universe to form and to dissipate. In another sense, it doesn't take any time at all, because what's even 15, 30, 70 billion years, what's that next to eternity? Eternity isn't a long time. It has nothing to do with time. It just simply is. There's that moment that is right now. Hard stuff to get your head around, isn't it? It's
absolutely.
Really tough.
Yeah, I am so fascinated by the concept of time being a non-linear idea, and that everything is happening simultaneously. That really intrigues me, but I have a hard time grasping it.
Yeah. I'm not sure we can get our brains around it. But the wonderful thing is that when you're outside of your body and you're not subject to that, you can't explain it, but you can accept the reality of it. It just seems normal.
Gotcha. It's second nature.
And then you come back and try to explain it to yourself, and you can't do it.
It just comes out. Blah, blah, blah.
or you try to write a book and find out how short you've fallen from reaching your goal. You know,
Absolutely.
it's really tough, really tough.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can only imagine. Well, I just want to ask a couple more questions, and then I want to be mindful of your time and let you go on with your evening. You mention an entity or a person. I don't know what would be the right way of describing it. Named Bridget in your book.
Yeah.
Tell us about Bridget.
I Bridget is the name I gave to the. There is male and female energy on the property in where we live, and I started having dreams about this Irish woman who was always down by the seashore looking out to sea, and I had the idea that she was waiting for her husband, the sailor, to come back, the fisherman, to come back. And all of a sudden, Bridget started showing up here in my out-of-body experiences and in my dowsing, this female energy. And so I decided I had to give Bridget a name. And it was the craziest thing. I would hold my dowsing rods. And of course, with dowsing rods, when you're having questions, all you can do is get yes and no answers. They either cross for a yes or open for a no. Mm-hmm. And I was very used to talking to the entity that I call Gaia, which I thought was earth energy, because a yes question, the rods would cross. When all of a sudden, one day, right out of the blue, I would ask a question and both rods would swing to the right. And that was that male counterpart, that spiritual guide who I call Sobuko. And that was the male energy that was in. All of a sudden, maybe 6 months later, I would ask a question and the rods would hesitate and then both swing to the left. And I realized that was a different entity. And through a series of yes and no questions, I realized this was the female energy that is on the land that I called Bridget, just because it seemed to be there. So is it connected at all with St. Bridget in Ireland? I don't have the faintest idea. But I do know that it's very real. And like most, Bridget doesn't have a chance to talk too much because the male energies that I connected with, we tend to dominate the conversation. But once in a while, the rods will swing left again, and I'll realize I'm getting a woman's perspective, which is very important.
That's great. How did you, not get in contact, but how did you, what's the word how did you realize that there was all this energetic stuff going on in your land? Because it's got some pretty intense shamanic energy, right?
Oh yeah, huge amount. And we found a lot of artifacts, stone artifacts. We're right up the Savannah River, just about 40 miles north on the Savannah River, where the famous Topper site is being the archaeological dig up there. And it's that has taken the world of archaeology by storm, because theoretically Clovis was the first culture that came here to America, and it's maybe 18,000 years old, maybe 30 tops, but most archaeologists don't even want to accept that. But here at the Topper site, they've discovered unequivocally human stone chips, lithic debitage, that was in soil that is at least 40 and sometimes 50,000 years old, very old. And that's right down the river from us. And if the people were there, they would have been right here. And then we started finding these spots. We have some, one friend in particular, she is very attuned, very psychic to this thing, and got me thinking about all this. And that's when I started dowsing for earth energy and discovered that we live right on a ley line with lots of energy lines going. We've made a medicine wheel down below us that we often go down and meditate there. And there is a shaman circle that probably, there's stones all over the ground. Probably at one time it was a stone effigy, I think in the shape of a hawk, right over the river from us in Georgia. There's a very famous hawk effigy and the eagle effigy, which are made out of stones in the same way. I think ours was probably destroyed because people saw this mound of stones and they wanted to use it for this or that or whatever, and just scattered the rest around on the ground. But I become absolutely convinced that it was a place where shaman used to gather, as the tribes would come here, because this was a stone quarry where they came to gather their material that they needed, the blanks that they needed to make their tools. And so I think they would gather here probably at the time of the winter solstice. And the reason I think it's the winter solstice is because there are these rock piles scattered all the way through the woods around us that mimic exactly on the ground the stars in the constellation Cygnus, especially the Northern Cross, which stands right over the horizon at the time of the winter solstice. And I'm certain what they were doing was bringing the sky, the heavens, down to earth by building these rock effigies at this particular time of the year, which makes me think they probably came here and gathered together. And this was probably a time when they would have weddings and ceremonies and dances and all this kind of stuff, gather the material they needed to make their stone tools for the next year. So it was quite an important place, and the shamanic presence is really strong here.
Wow. You didn't know any of that when you decided to move there?
We just knew we wanted to come here.
Nice.
It just called to us somehow. So
cool. How fortuitous.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, and there may have been something else working too. When we first talked about coming up here, we were living down in Florida, and we were looking for a place where, I just drew a circle. It was about a 6-hour journey. I wanted someplace with the woods that I can understand. I don't do palm trees very well. I don't know how to, but I've always been out in the woods up in New England and in Michigan, and this place looked interesting. And so I decided, well, I'll look around and see what there. So I sent some letters out to some real estate people. I got one back. He said, yeah, I've got a place I can show you. Come on up. Well, I wanted to find out what the place was like, so I went online to look at some local newspapers online. And there was 3 different newspapers around in the state of South Carolina that were running these articles on religion. And it was called the ABCs of Religion. It was a 26-day series. A is for Aaron, B is for Baptist, C is for Catholic, and everything else. And the one that I happened to find was U is for Unitarian. So I was reading it, and I said to my wife, Barb, I said, boy, this guy knows what he's talking about. And she started to laugh. She said, well, I hope he does. You wrote it. And I go, what? And down at the bottom, sure enough, source, Jim Willis, The Religion Book.
Oh, that's great.
My first big book for Visible Link, and it had been turned into this newspaper article. I had no idea. So I can't help but think that didn't have something to do with it, too.
That's funny. Well, at least you approved of your own definition of that.
Well, I'm glad I liked it. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't.
Yeah, exactly. If you had had some complaint about it, that would have been funny. Okay, so tell us about this, before we let you go, tell us about this new book that you have coming out in May.
It's called Hidden History, and it's the biggest, most sprawling book that I've ever written. It begins with all the different scientific and metaphysical ideas about where the universe came from, where the galaxy came from, how Earth developed life, how civilization developed. It starts with a big bang and it's going to end however it ends. And it isn't just saying this is the way it happened. It's saying these are all the different ways of understanding it. And there's scientific theories, all the different scientific theories. And then I go into the alternative theories and even get into the ancient alien school to find out in some cases. So that's coming out on May 1st or 2nd, I think, Hidden History. If anybody wants to follow any of these, my website is jimwillis.net, one word, jimwillis.net. And it has all my books and all stuff and articles that I've written and that kind of thing. And I also have a Facebook page at jimwillis.author. And Jan keeps that up. My daughter Jan keeps it up for me, and it tells people, it'll tell people that you and I talked, for instance, and all this kind of thing. So
fantastic.
And incidentally, I have to, before we go, I can't get away without thanking you, because I have discovered Twilight language.
Oh, cool.
And I am a big fan. I
Oh,
just
great.
love it, and I really want to thank you for that. It's
Oh,
not a day goes by that I'm delving into that more and more. So thank you for that work. I
oh
really
man,
appreciate it.
that is so good to hear because I have gotten to the point where I was thinking about just discontinuing it and totally focusing on this podcast. But that's definitely a nudge of encouragement right there.
Great, great.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah. Oh,
big fan right here. every day,
fantastic.
every day. You know, I'm thinking of you.
Thank you. Well, I will get to work on a new episode very, very soon. So thank you so much for that.
Uh,
I haven't heard a lot of feedback from that podcast, so that means a lot.
well,
Cool.
thank
Yeah.
you.
How did you just get it from the little tag on my email or?
Well, yeah, that's where it began. And then I was just looking at it, and I'm saying, well, that looks interesting. And so I clicked on it, and wow, I've been hooked on it for the last couple of weeks. I just can't get enough of it.
Oh,
I'm
fantastic.
really, really getting into it every day.
Great. That is so good to hear. Thank you so much. And
Well, thank you. Thank you.
yes, and I want to thank you for writing this book. I thought it was very, very well written and very informative. And I suggest anybody out there who's interested in OBEs, how to do it, your experiences with it, I highly recommend everybody out there read it. And they can order the book from your website too.
Yeah, they can order through the website or through Amazon or through Inner Traditions or there's also all kinds of things that I don't even understand, like books. Well, I don't know, author pages here and there. Just put in uh, put in jimwillis.net and that'll get you started. You can go.
And Jim, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to a chance when we can do it again.
Sounds good.
What an enjoyable conversation that was. Jim is just a very genuinely good person. I just really get that sense about him, and very knowledgeable. And I have the feeling that we just really just dusted the tip of the iceberg as far as all the different sorts of things that Jim has studied and researched and experienced throughout his life. And I just received his book that's going to be coming out in May in the mail today. So I am very excited about diving into it. And believe me, I will definitely have him on again after I've read that. Thank you so very much for listening to the show. I very, very much appreciate it. And to the 2 Patreons that I now have, I actually feel like somebody is listening out there. And I do get response, mostly through when I post my episodes on YouTube. But I very much appreciate hearing back from anybody who's listened and your comments and what you have to offer. And I really appreciate the patronage, absolutely. I'm hoping to build momentum in that area so that I can do bigger and better things with this show and branch it out into other areas. If you want to do that, you can go to www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast, and for as little as $1 a month, which you wouldn't even notice sneaking out of your bank account every month, you can. I mean, really, I have a few treats to offer, but they're kind of paltry at this point. I'm really counting on your good-hearted, good-natured selves to just help because you want to help. Even if that's $1, that is super helpful, and it's really about the energy that you put into that $1. And it doesn't even have to be financial. I think it's a very underrated form of support to spread the word, to send a link to your friend or a group on social media or that you know in real life, and put it in front of them, and let them experience it for themselves. And that is how the word spreads. That's really mostly what I use social media for these days, is to just advertise these episodes and this podcast and to try and garner some sort of support. I would love to be able to do this as my job. As it is, I only have so much time to dedicate to it because I've got other things to do. I've got 2 children. I've got to make money to keep the lights on, so on and so forth. So, there's only so big of a slice that I can give to this, but I would love to give it much bigger of a metaphorical slice, if not the whole damn pie, because it's what I'm truly passionate about, and I think it's important. Not because I have some sort of specific agenda to get across and that I'm trying to convince you of something by any means. I have no desire to do that at all. But if I can just get you thinking, or maybe present one sliver of something that you hadn't thought of before, or a part of the puzzle that you hadn't considered, or that you are hearing just a slightly different angle on it, that is beneficial. That adds to the greater conversation of humanity, and hopefully in a positive way, because I think first-hand experiences are important, and they are underrated in this society of scientific rationalism, where everything supposedly has to pass through the rigors of laboratory testing and some sort of tangible quantization. I don't know if that's the right way of saying that word, but to prove its existence. And I think that leaves out, almost everything. There are so many things that can't be measured, so many things that we take for granted, so many things that we don't question. But I think it's important to question. I think it's important to ponder. I think it's important to be curious. And so I just want to talk to people. I want to see what they think and feel about things, or what they study and why they wrote a book about something, because I think it's all important. Everybody has a slice. Everybody has a little bit to offer to the whole. If we are all interconnected, as we are seeing with this coronavirus situation, we're at a very heightened state of interconnectedness. So, it's important. We all play an important part. So firsthand experience, back to that. I always put out the plea for you to send in your recorded stories of experiences that you've had with, some things that we've talked about on the show, and things that you could see being talked about on the show. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just do it on your phone and send it in, themeltpodcast@gmail.com. Pretty easy to remember that. Send it in, and I will try and find an appropriate episode to put it in front of. I think it's important to have, sort of a continuing theme. So I wait to put on a story until it's just the right time. And sometimes that's months after I receive it. But I have to have them in the first place as an option to put on. So yes, thank you all again for listening. I have some fantastic shows coming up, as I always say, but it's only because it's always true. And hopefully that will always be true. And hopefully my every other Friday rhythm with this show can someday be every Friday. And maybe even more than that, have an extra show in there somewhere. So yeah, think about supporting, think about spreading the word, and just letting me know how you feel about this. And I'm always open to guest suggestions. All right. Until next time, take care of yourselves out there and be safe.